Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shub, and together with my partner and co host Patric, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all. It's oddly calming and reassuring, isn't it? That intro.
I have to say it's nice not to have any expectations for the show.
I know. Yeah. Wow, what a great setup for another episode.
Yeah, it already feels like a Seinfeld episode.
Yeah. Hey, I thought this week there's this interesting conversation that you and I were having, of course, prompted by thesis that you had developed over the week. Got us thinking. We've talked over several episodes on Practical Nerds about all of the various advancements in the CAD or the design tech stack for architects and the designers. And obviously we have made quite a few investments in those areas, but there's not too much happening in terms of CAD usage by contractors. Like, what does the future look like for them?
And this is preempted by big news coming out in the past 24 hours of Schneider Electric, a 190 years old company that is a big supplier to utilities, the energy grid operators, other infrastructure sectors, as well as building operators and owners, with hardware solutions and partially a data infrastructure solution that they acquired a few years ago. So we'll talk about that. And they just apparently confirmed, according to Financial Times, that they're in acquisition discussions with the US software provider Bentley, which is, I think we can say Bentley is the market leader globally in providing planning, design, and CAD software to the energy infrastructure in general, including the energy infrastructure. So this kind of triggered that. And since we've been working for a while on what we call CAD Wars, AEC's new battleground, and we know that there's a lot of, already happening in terms of new founder-led solutions for the AE part of the CAD Wars. We thought, hey, actually Schneider seems to be onto something. Let's talk about the CAD Wars from the perspective of the contractors. So that's what today is about. Do you want me to kick it off?
Go for it. I think you seem to clearly have dug into this one. Would love to get your views.
So perhaps just context setting, right? So when we think of CAD and more advanced, enriched CAD that leads you into a BIM solution, most people will either think of AutoCAD as the lower fidelity version or perhaps Revit as the higher fidelity BIM-enabled type version. And when people think of Revit, I would venture to guess that 7 to 10 out of 10, if not 8 out of 10, would associate it more with the architecture engineering practice, the whole planning and design of construction, than the actual construction execution. But truth be told, here's what happens when a construction project starts and where a CAD solution or a BIM solution like Revit is being used. So the planning and design process is almost over. Some architects, engineering firm for projects, they produce the BIM model. And the BIM model produced in Revit lacks critical details for actually doing quantity takeoffs because there's a ton of geometry that cannot be modeled in Revit without completely exploding your time because the software is not designed to model a ton of these details. A detail, for example, is what plaster to apply to a specific wall. That's all just kind of embedded in Revit's logic, but you cannot model it. You cannot model that level of detail very easily. So what happens now is that this model gets handed over in an ideal process to the general contractors that ought to bid in a tender onto this project. Mm-hmm. Why does it get handed over? Well, because the general contractors need to create a bid that is based on like the geometry, the quantities, the bill of materials that they can derive from it, and then come to a price. And oftentimes this would not be like a very long time that they can spend with the model. We're talking weeks rather than months here. And so now you have a relatively low fidelity model that gets handed over. And so that's where then a contractor would have an internal bidding team that uses colleagues that have Revit licenses or any other, let's say, CAD/BIM type solution to open the model, again, with not the sufficient fidelity, and then work with, for example, Revit, which has the same shortcomings for contractors, to kind of add some planning and detailing fidelity to it in order to come to better quantity takeoffs. It's a pain, right? So now we're moving into the contractor side of where a BIM model is being used. And it starts with this tendering process, but the tooling is really insufficient. It's very sufficient for the, let's say, lower fidelity type concept or detailed concept planning for AE, but it becomes very insufficient for the contractors. And so there is a really interesting opportunity that I'm learning about to build something like Snaptrude, something new challenger type tool, but that is focused on not starting a model from scratch, but rather taking whatever, Revit file or any competing file you get at this stage of the process and just focus on geometry enrichment. So your collaborative, cloud-based, browser-based, multiplayer type tool that has such a great functionality to enrich existing models with exact functionalities and workflow steps that a contractor at this stage does. So that's a really fascinating opportunity to me.
That is indeed quite fascinating, I have to say. I must admit, I haven't come across any firm doing this. So I kind of would lean on you a little bit to handhold me through at least some of the insights you've gleaned from what is being built here. Do you notice a different set of features being demanded, or features is perhaps too broad a question to ask, but let's say as a persona, I think we've gotten quite used to figuring out who architects and designers are as a persona and what they sort of tend to demand in the solutions they like to adopt. Is there a certain key feature when contractors have to interact with design or authoring tools? What features would they want or have they been crying out for, which the incumbents aren't giving them?
So it's, I think it's exactly the right question, because we saw a couple of weeks ago how Dustin over at Edify has raised a lot of money. And it has nothing to do with CAD, BIM, 3D at all, but he's building a collaborative tool set in order to help contractors facilitate the estimation process of their project across the different disciplines that need to contribute into a good estimation. And so here, this is the exact same workflow, but it revolves around a different core unit of truth, which is the 3D model or the BIM model. So instead of working with like a flat let's say, data set of, hey, here's already a spreadsheet. Can everybody please contribute like price numbers to it? This thesis starts for the contractor one step earlier, in actually before generating the spreadsheet, enriching the model. And so the features there, let me give you an example. So I already mentioned the plastering. So in Revit, when you model a wall 9 out of 10 times, if not more, the wall will be modeled as a 3D geometric block that has encoded some Revit logic to it, what this wall is being made of. But the problem is you might actually choose a different setup of the wall, a different setup of insulation, a different setup of plastering, etc. And so Revit doesn't really allow you to easily do that, which is why they have encapsulated like standard information into it. It's different, but it's kind of different, but always the same. And so what a tool like this would allow a contractor to do is load the Revit model, but with a high ease of use, basically select a room and say, apply this plaster. And then the plaster is getting actually modeled, not just encoded in the wall, but actually modeled in the authoring enrichment tool onto the walls. The same with insulation. And with insulation, it's kind of tricky, right? And you can see already how enrichment is really a difficult problem, because which direction do you apply the insulation to? When you have a wall like this, do you apply it to the left-hand side or to the right-hand side?
Yes.
So this is automation functionality in the authoring enrichment that your tool needs to provide for you, right? And so there's like 1,000 of these problems that a contractor today solves for, actually doesn't solve for, but if they solve for it, like they can only solve for it manually, that such a tool would do. And what I find fascinating here is when you build a new type Revit, most founders will think of it like, hey, I need to enable building models from scratch on a blank canvas. And so you need to build a lot of base functionality until you come to the point where you actually help with the data enrichment functionalities of your authoring. So what is interesting here is if you actually just skip all these steps in your thesis, in your product thesis, and you just say, hey, I come in with a contractor, I just come in with the data enrichment, all of a sudden you start with the nitty-gritty details of these workflow automations in your authoring tool, and you work your way backwards to the more functional or more base functionalities of a CAD BIM authoring type tool. So that's really a fascinating thesis to me.
That is really cool. And tell me, let's paint the picture of a solution like this eventually becoming the norm, right? For how contractors interact with multiplayer collaborative version of a CAD tool.
Yes.
Do you see it sort of acting harmoniously with, hopefully in our version of the future, a Snapshot-like solution, as in they sort of blend in where they bleed into each other depending on the use case and the persona viewing it? Does one tend to eat into the other? Does one precede the other and feed into the other? Like, what's the sequence?
So I think I have the answer for the next few years. I'm not sure I have the answer for choose your time frame, 10 years plus.
Okay.
So I think in the next few years, that's the beautiful piece about this product thesis, going after the contractor, going after the estimation process, going after data enrichment of existing models. You don't compete with Revit and the Revit peers.
Yep.
Quite the opposite. You actually take the input from them and you feed input back into them if someone wants that. Although I would think that once I've enriched it in a really good tool, I'm not going to feed it back. But it doesn't matter because there's no competition that way. It's a mutual enablement and a smooth handover that way. And also you're not really competing from the customer side. Of course, the contractors do buy Revit licenses, but here's another problem, right? So they typically don't buy enough Revit licenses because Revit is based still per seat.
Okay.
And they might be changing the pricing if you listen very carefully to what the vendor is saying.
Not just the pricing itself, but who you're beholden to for the relationship.
That's well put.
Yeah.
Which means that, in an architecture engineering firm, you oftentimes don't have a choice. You can't say, oh, I only buy a license for every second person. In the end, everybody needs to author in the tool.
Yes.
In a contractor company, that's not the case. So the way they optimize for that today in many contractor companies, again, I'm kind of generalizing, but I'm covering a broad truth of the market with my generalization here, is they would optimize for it, saying, hey, there's a specific team that is supposed to enrich for the estimation process, and for them we buy 5 Revit licenses. But now you come into the Edify thesis, why I mentioned that, you have 10 different disciplines that need to contribute and they don't have a Revit license. So how do they now open the model? They don't. And that's where it becomes a real mess, right? So here you're not really eating into the pie of Revit because it's not a big part of their market, is what I'm saying. But you're now offering, if you build this thing, what I'm just saying, you're offering a new solution where actually everybody can open the enriched 3D BIM file if you're actually not pricing it per seat, which I would not. But if you're pricing it more like a typical enterprise license, or there's some more creative ways how you can do it that does not constrain a widespread usage of users that collaborate in the model. So no, I don't think they will compete actually. They will enable each other in the short term. Now, long term,
You know, it's fascinating. It's also like a reminder, and of course we've said this before. I think one of our earlier episodes, if I had to take a guess, maybe episode 11 or 12 perhaps, on how, IT, more and more digitization and software solutions are being adopted in traditional construction firms. And I think quite often we get into this limiting mindset to think, there's only room for so many solutions in construction, because that's been the mindset historically. And it's all a zero-sum game. So if one firm, one set of solutions or one firm goes up, it has to be at the expense of the other. Yeah. But I mean, hey, for example, if everyone using a computer can use, for instance, Microsoft suite of tools, right, and benefit from that, why can't, a contractor, for example, have the benefit of some sort of authoring or design solution customized for their use case, right? Just because, there's this gate with pricing and whatnot set, which is artificially restricting access. I think if you envision a future where adoption of tech in construction is secularly growing and eventually becomes ubiquitous, you will need all these solutions which open the floodgates but allow everyone to have their own versions of these new age solutions.
I fully and wholeheartedly agree. And I'm an investor that tends to start diligence in the 3D CAD BIM space with product. So I'm very product first that way. But even I will say that actually most markets are won with distribution. The product in the end is a enabler, is a differentiator, is a way to capture and protect value, but the way you win is always through the distribution. And you already see that for the past 50 years of CAD software. Every CAD vendor, not every, but every of the large CAD vendors out there has CAD for AEC and has CAD for manufacturing.
Yes.
Because the core engine oftentimes allows you to customize tools in one direction or the other. But still, you will have one vendor that dominates a large part of the manufacturing space, and you will have another vendor that dominates a large part of the AEC space. Yeah. Although the products are, both have products that are able to serve each other.
Yes.
So what's the difference? It's been distribution, right? Which means you can actually build super substantial companies with competing products by differentiating on the distribution.
That is pretty cool. I think that's another manifestation, I guess, of how distribution works in these sort of products, since we're talking about software and design tools, is the manner in which you integrate or which workflows you choose to integrate yourself into, right? So I guess since you brought up takeoffs and also brought up the example of Edify with estimation, do you foresee a future where this sort of solution, I mean, loosely let's choose to call it CAD for contractors. I know it's a terrible way of putting it, but let's go with that, like CAD for contractors. Do you think this CAD for contractors can sort of wedge itself in the traditional estimating and takeoffs kind of workflow and drives it?
I think that you're nailing the question, Shub. Because it's the bigger vision and question to answer here. So if you're just selling, let's say, a better manipulation of 3D data, you could building something very substantial for the contractor business, because like I laid out, they're starved for a easy data enrichment of BIM data. And something I didn't mention, quick detour. Many of our listeners that are from architecture and engineering will have heard this. If you're not from there, you might have never heard it. So there's like a funny joke that every second contractor will keep saying, and that is, architects can't do BIM. Like you hear this a lot. And it's actually not true. Architects can absolutely do BIM, but there's two things why they don't. The first one is because the tooling is not detailed enough, everything we just discussed. And the second thing is they don't get paid for it. Because the hours of actually then enriching the BIM model after it has been in a state where you can, tender out the project to contractors, nobody pays them for it anymore. Yeah. So, I mean, you can't blame them. Which means that there are reasons, two very fundamental reasons, why the BIM models that the contractor receives are not enriched enough, are not detailed enough, right? So just by going after that opportunity, I think you can build a very substantial company. But I'm quite excited about what Dustin at Edify is building, because the thesis of, hey, it's an inherently collaborative workflow, estimating that is, but people are not getting properly collaborating on it, and there are roadblocks of doing it, and nobody's looking at the same thing. It's almost like a Figma type thesis.
Okay.
Makes inherent sense to me. But I wonder, and I wonder very strongly, I have to say, whether if you actually open and unify these collaborators for the estimation process around the 3D model, you would eat that space entirely.
Yeah.
I have an early intuition that that would be the case.
I mean, look, one thing that we had touched upon when we had Altaf over, as well as when we spoke about Snaptrude in a separate episode, the opportunity exists, and in some ways, for example, Snaptrude is showing early signs of it. Even though, takeoffs and estimation is not provided as like or marketed as like one of the flagship use cases we have, you could use Snaptrude, for example, in a limited way to do some basic, things of that sort. You can also use it as a platform into which other solutions are integrated, wherein you do other ESG related stuff and sustainability reporting or designing around sustainability considerations. You could do all of that stuff. I wonder if, you can kind of create this solution, which in the beginning has the resemblance of being a design solution or this design add-on type thing, but it's a Trojan horse in the sense all these other tools plug into it, and therefore it's kind of like the hub from where you do all these other workflows as well.
Exactly, because I keep saying this on Practical Nerds and to founders I chat with. There's only 3 core resources in construction, and if you own one of them, you can orchestrate stuff. It's atoms, it's space, and it's money. And so in the 3D tool, you're actually, if you the authoring tools, if you're doing it right, you're already manipulating 2 of them, the atoms and the space. And so that's also, by the way, why getting as built back into the BIM is so valuable. It's incredibly difficult. And I can talk about that with regard to the data enrichment thesis that we talk about now. Let's park that for a few minutes.
Sure.
But that's why it's so valuable, because you get the atoms within the space actually correct. But even if you don't do the as-build, you just do the design and plan around the atoms and the space, you own 2 of the first principles of how that everything revolves around, which is if you don't have that and you're like a flat solution for estimation, here's already the exported spreadsheet, you're missing the atoms and the space. You already are one step too far.
Yes.
And so once there is like the hub, like you say, the data hub around the atoms and the space that allows to do the same kind of collaborative estimation, I think you're going to eat the space.
By the way, I have to contain myself from chuckling when you said atoms, because I know a few investors who at a high level summarize what they're looking for. And I'm actually quoting here, but I'll not take names. What they're looking for is bits, not atoms. So there you go.
Okay. I'm glad. That means I can win a lot of deals that actually manipulate atoms. I'll take it.
Indeed. Yes.
I wonder how these investors feel about space technology, by the way.
Anyway, I wish I could indulge that conversation. I know that the moment I answer this question, the clever detective kinds of our viewers and listeners will probably be able to start triangulating and figure out who or which people we are talking about. So we'll save that for maybe another time.
Okay. I think I'll have to do some detective work.
Yes.
Now. Yeah, so, and I was hinting at this, right? So the as-built back into the BIM. It's an unsolved problem. Whatever I actually, so there's the design and the plan and the BIM model, and it's great, right? And so the more enriched I have it, the better I will do a quote. and the better I am prepared to do good execution. But at some point, I'm putting atoms into space.
Yes.
In the real space, that is, and the real atoms, that is, not in planning and design, but in the actual execution. And so things will happen. The screw will sit further on the right, the duct will be a little bit perhaps to the left compared to the model. And so it's an unsolved issue, but one that many find quite valuable, of getting the as-built back into the BIM. Why? Because operators of let's say large infrastructure, large buildings, need to know where stuff is over the next 50 to 100 years in order to do proper maintenance, proper repairs, planning all of that, etc. And so if your as-built is quite different from the planned BIM model, you might not have the amount of information that would help you make good purchasing decisions, good maintenance decisions, etc., which can be costly if you run an airport, for example, if you run a mall, if you run a tunnel, right? So it's an unsolved problem with potentially high value. Now, why is it never fed back into the BIM model? Honestly, it's not a hard answer. The answer is because there's no mobile versions of manipulating my BIM model, and two, there is no sign-off workflow of someone manipulating it and someone accepting the change. So that's a GitHub problem. Or a Git problem, I should say. And three, so it's not mobile, it's no Git. And three, it's just the tooling is not good enough to allow an untrained person manipulate a 3D model and enrich a 3D model easily. And so someone that builds what we're debating here would probably by accident fix all these things already. So you can even fix the as-built part of the contractor phase and then handing it over into operations.
That would be super cool.
So the whole point here is, if you're paying attention, you're deliberately going after a different phase that is not architecture engineering, but that is construction. Two, you're deliberately not building an authoring tool that allows you to build models from scratch initially, but initially you focus on taking existing 3D models and limiting the authoring just to its enrichment and detailing. But three, in doing so, you're not building a simpler tool, you're actually building a more complicated tool, because your focus in enriching it is doing all the difficult things that the traditional authoring tools are not doing, and you're for these details, you're adding automation. And because you do these three things, you go after contractors, you go after the bidding process, you already fix, probably by accident, also the as-built part of feeding back into the BIM and then being able to hand it over into operations. In doing so, you're probably building a mobile version of your authoring tool as well. But to do that, let's now talk technology, Shub.
Okay.
There's a lot of technologies that need to come together for you to be able to build that. There's cloud, there's browser, there's multiplayer, meaning, at the very least concurrency.
Yes.
But you need to be able to actually condense the rendering down so that the streaming can happen on site on a mobile device. You also need to have a very strong UX philosophy that allows you to have progressive discovery in the user experience, because your users will not be trained, 10, 15, 20-year architects that are trained on a model, right? So you will have a ton of, in this thesis, untrained users that need to interact with a 3D model. So your UX needs to come from a progressive discovery type philosophy.
Yeah.
So when you hear all this, how does it, what's your investor intuition? Because I never shared this with you prior to this call. It's the first time you're hearing this. What's your investor intuition?
So I feel like once you get to a situation where there's a team or a firm which has built a working version of a product that is ready for one or two firms to actually adopt, which, by the way, when I say adopt, it doesn't mean just randomly run a beta or something of that sort, as in do something where they've actually put out some of their actual designs on it and are using it to figure out how it runs, and to use it for the purpose of designing it, and in this case for the contractors to figure out what's been built, etc. I think to get to that stage with this product will be itself a huge milestone. And I think a firm that actually gets to that stage would have created enormous value. I would imagine not too many firms will begin the race if this was to be a race, right? Not too many firms will sign up for the challenge, because I think it's a lot to cram in. As, by the way, is also true for some of the other firms we have spoken about, in the firms that are disrupting the tech stack. But this also, I think, seems one of the more challenging problems to solve.
Absolutely.
If you get to that stage, I think just getting to that stage, I think, is already signs of some moat being built, and potentially a firm primed for rapid value creation.
And anybody who has built this for, like, let's say 3 years into the journey, and you have terrific shipping velocity, you know what you're doing. So obviously you can be 3 years into the journey and have built nothing, right?
Yeah.
So, but having actually built like 3 years with high shipping velocity and prioritizing the right, making the right product decisions, I mean, you might already be uncatchable.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
I think because for a new entrant, there's too many, features to take care of simultaneously to get a. I mean, I don't want to use the word MVP, because I think that doesn't do justice to this space. But let's say, for the sake of discussion, an MVP plus kind of a product, I think a lot needs to be done to get an MVP in place. And I think there's quite a few disincentives in place for the incumbents to either not try or not be able to try to build this over the same time period.
So let me build on exactly that part that you just said, Shub. So on the face of it, when someone were to present the thesis we're right now discussing as, oh, it's a CAD for contractors, you might be thinking, okay, I mean, it's a CAD. Revit could perhaps just tweak a few things and get there. Or BricsCAD, or, you name it.
Yeah.
Any CAD / BIM enabled CAD tool.
Sure.
Could make this. But actually, I don't think you can. Because there's like very fundamental, first of all, there's very fundamental technological difference, because you probably need to have a rendering technology that is good enough for the browser. To give you a detail, Chrome just a few weeks ago actually released the ability to cache 4 gigabytes.
Okay.
Up until a few weeks ago, Chrome had maximum 2 gigabytes of buffering.
I see.
Which for detailed CAD models is like, I mean, you're really, really stretching it. And then there's the mobile part of it. So if you want this to be used by people on the site to collaborate with you on a mobile phone, for example, you need to think of the streaming limitations.
Yes.
And the bandwidth limitations. So from a fundamental technological perspective, you cannot build this on a rendering stack that is built for a desktop solution, both desktop in terms of connectivity to a landline, as well as desktop in terms of a desktop app that doesn't run in the browser.
Yeah.
So that's one. 2, the UX philosophy must be with progressive discovery, because you will have untrained users that will use this literally only a few days, and then they will go on and do all the rest. They do not have to spend, they won't have the time to learn for 10 years how to use a cluttered interface and how to learn it. And even if you now declutter your interface, still the buttons will not mean anything to them. And there's too many buttons that outside of the context I'm currently looking at will confuse me. So a progressive discovery UX is absolutely essential to this. I'm completely convinced. But to change your product philosophy that is not progressive discovery to this, I have never seen it. I don't think it works. So that's the second. And then there's more core technology to this that there's browser, there's multiplayer, there's, advanced concurrency for multiplayer, etc. You would have to build all of this into your tech stack. So my point is, if you describe it as CAD for contractors, you might be coming to the wrong conclusion. You might be thinking, I already have a CAD, I can just offer it. No, you can't. You would not be building what I'm proposing someone should be building.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I think it's the same thing when sometimes people undermine, I'm stating the obvious at this point. If incumbents could easily build a Figma, it's not so straightforward, and definitely not. And again, at the risk of, I guess, patting or pointing out complexities in the space that we operate in. And keep in mind, CAD is I think about a 40-year-old solution at this point. 40 years ago, it was absolutely cutting edge, right? And at that point, it still needed a lot of things to done. So even for the next generation, you need to up your game on all of these different dimensions that CAD disrupted 40 years ago.
Yeah.
You can't just pick one and choose to innovate on that one.
Yeah. No, exactly right. And then there's so much that you also have to forget about your users, and you have to relearn, because every product that is like 20, 30 years old was built on certain user empathy that was back then. But what changed is the context of the user, right? So their tech stack changed, their job changed, the market environment for them changed, the interactions with other participants, processes might have been more advanced, etc. So the context of the user change, which also means that the user is working differently today than they were 20 years ago. But your product is still built on the empathy and the discovery of the user that you did back then. So you would actually have to, and most incumbents, I can say with conviction, 100% of the incumbents that I ever got to work with will not be able to do that.
Yeah.
To make just the choice of doing a deliberate customer discovery and empathy building the way a founder from scratch would. And that will prevent you of actually making all these choices that we're debating here.
So I fully agree with all of those things. I think there's another, I feel a very simple explanation, and it's not just cannibalization, which is also, of course, true. I think it will actually involve them having to admit that a lot of their product and their pricing and the way they gatekeep the stuff sucks.
Aha.
And the moment you admit that, you're toast as a company, right? So, or at least your share price takes a nosedive. So
now this is first principle.
Right? So why would any company admit that we suck? So, and the way you not admit that you do not suck is to let things be. Yeah.
Keep going. You're right. And then squeeze the lemon.
Exactly.
This is a side note, and this is actually, I want to do a separate Practical Nerds just on what I'm about to quickly tease. So I'll make a note of this. I do a little bit of public stocks, not much. The reason why I don't do much is not because I don't understand the stock market. I do. I know how to invest and what to invest in. It's just that what I like to invest in, there's so few of. And that is, I have learned not to invest in companies which are not led by a major shareholder that has bought the money with their own sweat, tears, and money. Bought their shares with their own sweat, tears, and money. I will not invest in companies that are led by employees at the very top, where the CEO is employed and has not founded the company and thus earned their shares, or bought into the company to have a substantial ownership. I just refuse to invest in these companies. Why? Why am I refusing them? Well, because it comes with more. It's closer to being a politician than it is to being an owner. Because I have to think about election cycles. When does my supervisory board or my chairman offer me a renewed contract? So now all of a sudden, the whole company is making certain strategic decisions, product decisions, channel decisions, pricing decisions on the basis of the next term. You might not like what I'm saying, and if you're such an employed CEO in a publicly listed company, you will right now think that, oh, this doesn't apply to me. Unfortunately, it does 99.9 out of 1,000 times, or out of 100 times. And That's exactly explaining what you have just pointed out to me.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, would love to have that topic. I think anyone who thinks or has a reaction to what you said not being true, all you have to do is do a analysis in the past of behavior leading to allocation of dividends and share buybacks, what that has done to, and you plot that with regard to share price changes. I think you'll find a very odd pattern. Odd pattern which actually doesn't have any correlation with performance, but something else altogether.
Exactly. Which means also, back to now our topic from today, any incumbent that has such a structure, no, I don't think they would make all these choices that you need to make in order to truly build what we're proposing to build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Wow, what a interesting place to end up, given where we started.
Okay, so one of the next practical nerds is going to be us rambling about what types of founder ownership structures we're not going to invest in. That should make fun for a fun topic.
Absolutely.
So our little ritual here, Shub, in your calendar next week, something you're excited about?
So in addition to, a running theme, I've spoken, I think, the last 2 episodes maybe, on something to do with grid management and so on. There's another interesting opportunity I'm digging into, which I must admit I have been looking for a company like this for more than a year, but finally seeing like 2 or 3 come at the same time. I guess that's life and that's VC for you on organizing the electrical goods supply chain, specifically focused on electrical goods. And I think it's fascinating how in certain parts of the world, you see massive publicly listed companies doing just that. But in many other parts of the world, that is not the case. So also building a thesis for which might explain this disparity.
That does sound very interesting to me. And we've been referencing the opportunity in that supply chain the opportunity in that supply chain, that sector, energy infrastructure upgrading multiple times over practical notes. So if you paid attention, this should not come as a surprise to you that Shub is very excited about this. On my end, I have a ton of founder meetings next week. That in itself excites me because I had a little bit other things to do in the past week. So that's pretty great. One of my favorite companies is having a board meeting, Speckle, doing very well. Looking forward to that too.
Excellent.
Good. Well, so this was quite vibrant, I have to say. Thanks for sparring with me on this.
Yeah, it was quite vibrant. I'll agree with that assessment.
Yeah. And then if you're a founder, so perhaps to some people it was way too abstract today what we discussed. If you never spent time in the CAD space or the contractor estimation workflow, you're perhaps more like this meme of doing math and you're trying to figure out the head math. But if you do know the estimation workflow, if you do know CAD, I bet you got exactly what we're talking about. And so if you are building in this or you want to be building in this, reach out to me. Yeah,
you should do that.
Good. So Shub is reaching out to me after this podcast.
Yes, I'm doing that as well.
All right, sir. I wish you a happy weekend.
I wish you a lovely weekend too, sir.
Cheers.
Cheers.